Hey guys! Welcome to the third episode of Parliamentary California. Parliamentary California is a 7 episodic miniseries of me advocating and sharing my own ideas of how I would implement a parliamentary system in my home state of California for our state government, in which the state assembly elects the governor of California and all the other statewide executive officers as well, based on a coalition that forms among among political party leaders in our state assembly, except for the lieutenant governor. And I'll get to that in a future episode. And as you watched, and if you watched the second episode of Parliamentary California, you will already know that I advocated for the complete dissolvement of California's state senate and just calling for a unicameral or single house legislature, where the state assembly is the only house in the legislature, the supreme house of the legislature, to make all the decisions of how taxpayer money is spent, which policies get implemented, and most notably, how to run the government. Because I ultimately believed that unicameral legislatures would make California state government more democratic, it would make our government more efficient, and it will enhance cooperation between the legislative branch and the executive branch, being the governor of California. And because of that, the unicameral legislature part is just one piece to the puzzle of how I would build a parliamentary system in the state of California. So that's just one piece to the puzzle. And the next piece to the puzzle has to do with term limits. Boy, this video is going to be a bit of an unpopular stance among American citizens and some California voters, mainly because if you watched my most recent Fixing American Democracy episode, where I called for the immediate repeal of the 22nd Amendment, which established 2 term limits, and I said it's completely undemocratic and it's a really terrible amendment. You may already know that this is that the opinions that I'm going to share in this video is a very unpopular thing to say. But I believe overwhelmingly I am vehemently against term limits, and you already know my stance on this issue. But getting rid of term limits in California state legislature is just another part of the puzzle to create a parliamentary system in the state of California. And in part of this third episode, I advocate for the repeal of Prop 140 and Prop 28. So let's get started, shall we? So before I begin on sharing my proposals and why I believe Prop 140 and Prop 28 should be repealed in the state of California, we first have to know a little bit of history on Prop 140 and Prop 28 and some of the effects that this proposition had on California state government. So, Proposition 140, it was passed in the month and year of November 6th of 1990, and the biggest thing that it did in California is that it implemented 2 term limits for all statewide executive officers, such as the governor, lieutenant governor, controller, and so forth. It also installed 3-term limits for state assembly members, and it imposed 2-term limits for state senators. It also reduced some additional government cost as well. But the biggest change that Prop 140 made to California's state government is that it imposed term limits on California's state government. And because of that, it had unintended consequences and a little bit of positive effects or mixed results of how it ultimately changed the California state government. And I will share that to you now. So, with the passing of Proposition 140, it had mixed and unintended effects on California state government. So, one of those effects that Prop 140 had on California state government is that there was a lot more legislative turnover. And what I mean by that is that there was more special elections. And this had a lot to do with the fact that many incumbents in the state legislature either resigned, they were elected or appointed to other offices, and they also pursued other job prospects as well. And this was largely due to term limits. And as you see on this graph here, in 1990, the turnover rate stayed the same, but around close to 1992, the legislative turnover rate increased, and then it went down a little bit around this point in 1992. This was actually 1991 that it increased, and then in 1992, it decreased. Sorry for the confusion I just said earlier, but to reiterate again, in 1991, it did increase a little bit, and then in 1992, it went down, and then in 1994, there was a lot more legislative turnover, and this had a lot to do with the fact that a lot of these incumbents resigned. They were either elected or appointed to other offices, and they also pursued other job prospects as well. And this was largely due to term limits, in part because as the status quo were starting to become term limited in California state legislature. More seats opened up, which also led to more special elections. I would argue that it had somewhat of a good and bad thing as well. So in 1980, there were 80 new legislators, and in 1990, that number increased to 160. So, to reiterate again, in 1980, there were 80 new legislators, and in 1990, that number increased to 160. So, having a lot more legislative turnover was just one effect that Prop 140 had on California's state legislature and government. Another effect, and this is a positive effect, so supporters of term limits, you are right that it increases women and minority representation. You see, after Prop 140 passed, there was a dramatic increase in the number of women and minorities elected to California's state legislature. You see, 71% of assemblywomen replaced a term-limited assembly member. And also, 85% of minorities were elected in districts that opened up due to term limits. So people that I talked to who supported term limits and said that it would allow for more younger voices to get elected in office and would increase women and minority representation in our government. You are right about that. You are 100% right. This is where you are right in this realm. It does increase women and minority representation. You will see newer voices in California state government. And I will admit that I am wrong at this point. That I am wrong on this. Is that and you are right on this point, is that it does increase women and minority representation. You're right, and I'm wrong on this point. But even though it increased women and minority representation, the one thing that term limit advocates hope that it would also do is get rid of career politicians. Well, they were wrong on this point. You see, Prop 140 did not get rid of career politicians. So let me simplify it for you. Term limits did not get rid of career politicians. It did not get rid of career politicians. So term limits created more opportunities for local office holders to get elected in California state legislature, in part because they had the wealth, the connections, and the experiences to run and win legislative seats. I said this in the first episode of Parliamentary California, where I talked about if third parties want to gain more prominence and influence in our politics, whether it's at the state or national level, they should start in their local communities first. Run for city council, run for county board of supervisors, run for your local HOA position, or your Encinitas or your school district board, or run for water district manager in your area. Start in your local communities first, because it is much more easier to get into politics at the local level. And when you start doing that, you are then gaining the connections, you're building upon your wealth, and you're also gaining more experience on how to better run and win legislative seats, which means you are becoming a career politician. You are becoming a career politician. And where you can take all your skills that you have made in your local offices and expand that to state legislature, to Congress, to the U.S. Senate, to the governor's office, or if you ever decide to run for the presidency of the United States of America. Start in your local communities first if you want to get into politics. Don't start right up. Don't just start shooting all the way up to the presidency. Start in your local offices, because it is much more easier and cheaper to get elected in your local communities. It's much more easier to do so and to gain the wealth, the connections, and the experiences to actually run and win a successful election. So this idea, and while I respect those that really do want to see citizen legislatures and part-time legislatures, I don't think that's realistic in our world today. I think we just have to accept the reality that term limits, that our not term limits, that our politics has become dominated by career politicians. We just have to accept it. We just have to accept career politicians, because, like it or not, it is a career. These people chose to get into politics for a reason. For me, as one of the reasons why I chose to get into politics is in part because of electoral reform. I care about our country and our country's democracy. I want to make our democracy a better place for all Americans and Californians, where all voters have a political party that they can best align with, and that will better share and represent their values in the legislature. And it's also why I do support a parliamentary system in the state of California as well. But I digress. So according to one article here that I got from another article, I don't remember the article's name, but it shared some data of what term limits had. It shared some of the effects that term limits had on California state legislature, in which I quote here on this slide: a number of new members who were former legislative staffers dropped from 40% in the 1980s to 16% in the 1990s. But the percentage of local office holders who won legislative seats increased from 52 to 64%. So in this regard, the people who are younger, more ambitious, and more professional, who started at the local level, who already had the wealth, the connections, and the experiences, they were mostly the ones that benefited from term limits, and not part-time legislators. So this idea that term limits would get rid of career politicians, it's a myth. You will never, ever get rid of career politicians. It's something that we just have to accept in our politics. It's something we just have to accept because, like it or not, politics is a career. People that do decide to get into politics and run for office, they decided to make it their career because they want to represent their communities. They want to do the people's work and making other people's lives better. Politics will and always will be a political career, which is why you will never, ever get rid of career politicians. So another effect that Prop 140 had on California state legislature or state government as a whole, on elected officials, is that it saw an increase in partisanship. So from the start, Republican lawmakers' opinions were largely ignored post Prop 140 era. And this is in part because many Republicans that were elected to the state legislature originally came from local governments that were nonpartisan. So these Republicans that came from those local offices, which were nonpartisan, they were so experienced in working under a nonpartisan environment, but they were unprepared for the party line divide that the state legislature was all about, which meant that you saw really ineffective Republican lawmakers, and a lot of their opinions were largely ignored because, like it or not, even currently in this day and age, Democrats, after this most recent election, still have a supermajority in the state, in both houses of the state legislature, which means they don't have to really listen to the Republicans' opinions in their state legislature. What we really saw is an increase. Term limits saw an increase in partisanship in the state of California, And we're definitely seeing it today. California is one of the most democratic states in the union. It's solidly blue, even though in 2024 we did see an increase in Republican support in California on the presidential election level, and some counties did flip Republican. But like it or not, Democrats still have control in California's state legislature. They can still do whatever they want because they have a supermajority. They don't really have to consult with Republicans, which means their opinions are largely ignored. So term limits have led to an increase in partisanship in the state of California. And as to prove it even more, according to one article by Bruce E. Kane and Thad Kaiser, I could be pronouncing that wrong, in their article, Adapting to Term Limits, Recent Experiences and View Directions, and they both quoted on page 17, yearning for the days when legislators listened and learned. One senior Democratic legislator claimed that new members come to Sacramento with an artificial urgency created by term limits to get things done when they get here. This often means that there are people screaming rather than listening. This goes back to what I said earlier about Republican lawmakers' opinions being largely ignored. It's in part because Republicans and Democrats now in Sacramento, instead of listening to one another, they just start screaming their heads off. There's no wanting to work with each other and work with each other for the common good to make California a golden and more and prosperous and wealthy state for all Californians. They would rather engage in partisan bickering instead of solving problems and listening and developing an understanding with the other side. And because of that, term limits increased partisanship. It increased partisanship. It's just another effect. So, the other effect that term limits has had on legislatures is that you also saw a reduction in legislative expertise. What I mean by this is that there's no incentive for legislatures to develop an expertise on a specific issue or a specific policy issue, or there's no incentive for them to want to garner institutional knowledge anymore. In part because state assembly members are limited to 3 2-year terms, and state senators are only limited to 2 4-year terms. And because of that, you have a result. Because of that, the end product is that you have more and more inexperienced lawmakers. You have more and more inexperienced lawmakers, and because of that, policy focus is more short-term, which means you have less expertise in the long term. So you have less state legislatures spending more time in the legislature, gaining more policy expertise, and in developing institutional knowledge over time and becoming effective lawmakers. So you have less effective lawmakers in the term limit era in California. So in going back to the same article by Bruce E. Kane and Thad Kaiser, they quote again on page 17 through page 18, where they talked about some of the experiences that newer members had during the term limit era in California after Prop 140 was passed. So, as I quote them again, Another experienced legislator who had served since the 1980s said that the new members were quite talented, but that they are not given the opportunity to grow. This goes right back to my point on legislative expertise. You have less and less of that because while these new members are talented members, they have less opportunity to grow and evolve and to develop an expertise on a specific policy issue. They have less opportunity to grow to become better and even more effective lawmakers. The point that I'm trying to make is that things take time to implement. And as I said in my most recent Fixing American Democracy episode, where I talked about persuading you why the 22nd Amendment ought to be repealed, I mentioned the fact that things take time to implement. And as I said earlier, and as I quoted from a movie before, you can't rush art. It's a slow process to make progress. We have to learn to be patient. This goes right back to developing legislative expertise in the lawmaking process. It's a slow and gradual process. We just have to learn to be patient. So the less legislative expertise and the inexperienced lawmakers, it's just another effect to term limits. It's just another effect that term limits has had on California state legislature. You see an increase in less legislative expertise. You see an increase in inexperienced and ineffective lawmakers, which means poorer laws in which policy focus is more short term than long term. So, and because of that, because of less legislative expertise, the lobbyists have more influence and power in the lawmaking process, in part because state lawmakers, because they're term limited, relied a lot more on lobbyists to draft or create bills. New members even confessed that in their first year in office, over 90% of their bills were drafted or was given to them by lobbyists. And when they were mastering, and even though they mastered the legislative process quicker, they had help from lobbyists and their staff to do so. They relied much more on lobbyists, which means lobbyists have more influence in the lawmaking process where it's easier for them to get their agenda through. So term limits really made it easier for lobbyists to pass their laws, to pass their agenda, for the legislature to pass special interests' agenda in terms of anything that they're advocating for. It made it much more easier for lobbyists to game the lawmaking process. So because of the less legislative expertise, this is what led to Prop 28. Proposition 28 was passed on the month, year, and day of June 5th of 2012. And what this did was it removed the limit of 2 4-year terms of state senators. It also removed the limit of 3 2-year terms for state assembly members. And it ultimately created a lifetime term limit of 12 years in the state legislature. So assembly members and state senators can now serve in the legislature, can now serve in both houses for 12 years. This was created in part so that legislatures can learn how to do their job well and to develop an expertise to get things done. It passed overwhelmingly compared to Prop 140, where it was a lot more closer. But this time it passed with 61% of Californians in 2012 voting overwhelmingly for the proposition. And like I said earlier, it was to make it easier for so that legislatures had a little bit more time to learn and gain institutional knowledge, to develop policy expertise, and to ultimately learn how to become better lawmakers and to pass really great legislation. So overall, in my opinion, this leads me to the most important part of this video. It is time to repeal Prop 140 and Prop 28. It is 100% time to get rid of term limits for California's state government for all elected officials. It is time. And there's several reasons why I support getting rid of term limits. For one, it is undemocratic. I said this, and I'm going to repeat this again. I said this in another video. We already have a system in place to hold politicians accountable, and that is through free and fair elections in which we, the people of the state of California, can either vote to re-elect someone or vote out someone out of office, or reward their party with a larger majority or governing mandate to further their agenda, or we can vote in their oppositional party to create a more checks and balances and separation of powers type approach where politics is more cooperative and more built on dialogue and coalition building. We already have a system in place, and that is through elections. And imposing term limits on elected officials is undemocratic. It makes California's government less and less democratic. Another reason is that term limits also decrease legislative expertise. While you might have an increase in newer members to the legislature where they are quite talented, they will not be given the opportunity to actually grow and become even more effective lawmakers, where they can pass better laws, where they can grow and evolve during their tenure in the legislature. Because they know that their time is limited to the point that they're just rushing to get laws through, and they're turning to lobbyists. And this goes into my other reason. Lobbyists have more influence when you start term limiting politicians. And that is something we don't want. That's not something we want, because what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now, lobbyists have more influence. The special interest groups have more influence in our politics. Big money have more influence. And if we just start term limiting politicians, those lobbyists will even have more influence in our government. And also, term limits increase partisanship as well. It also increases partisanship as well because people would be, because newer members will be more incentivized to scream their heads off at the other side rather than listening to the other side, in which they're largely ignoring the opposition, where the opposition literally has no input in the lawmaking process, where their viewpoints are just largely ignored because both sides are just screaming their heads off at each other. So, 4 reasons to get rid of term limits. For one, getting rid of term limits will make California democratic again. It will make us a more democratic system of governance. 2, it will increase legislative expertise, in which newer members are given more, have more time and are given the opportunity to actually grow, gain more institutional knowledge of how the lawmaking process works, of how government works, and to also develop a policy expertise on a particular issue. 3, the lobbyists will have less clout and less influence when we get rid of term limits. And 4, it will reduce partisanship because elected officials will no longer be screaming their heads off at each other. They will be listening to the other side and developing an understanding with the other side, in which politics will be more cooperative, more deliberative, and based more on coalition governance. And this is why we should get rid of term limits. It will make California's government more democratic again. Make California democratic again. It will also increase legislative expertise. Lobbyists will have less clout, and it will reduce partisanship as well. So, now, since you know why I believe we should repeal Prop 140 and Prop 28 and just get rid of term limits for elected officials, now I will offer my own proposals to how I would reform politicians' term lengths, specifically for the state assembly. And this relates right back to the second episode, where I advocated for a unicameral legislature, where California state government will just have a single house legislature, in which under my proposals to getting rid of term limits, I also advocate to increase the state assembly members' term lengths from 2 to 4 years, with their election years being on the same year as the governor and for all the other executive officers. So every 4 years we would have an election for the state assembly and also for the governor and for all the other statewide executive officers. I also call for the end of term limits for all elected officials, being for state assembly and for statewide executive officers, except for the lieutenant governor. And you all may be asking me, why are you going to get rid of term limits but not for the lieutenant governor? Aren't you arguing against? Aren't you arguing for the repeal of term limits in California state government? Well, yeah, I pretty much am, and I'll get to this in a future episode of mine, when I start advocating for changing the electoral system and voting system to elect our state assembly, and I'll get to that and I'll get to that in the future episode. But this goes back to a previous video of mine, where I talked about repealing the 22nd Amendment, and I offered you a compromise, and and where I compromise with term limit advocates in saying that I would be willing to accept term limits if we just limited them to a consecutive term and giving them the option to run again for that same office by running for a non-consecutive term. And that's exactly what I plan to do with the lieutenant governor. The lieutenant governor will remain as the only term limited elected official, where the lieutenant governor will serve a single 4-year consecutive term. And there's a reason why I did this, because in my second episode, I didn't just advocate for a unicameral legislature. I also advocated to split the head of government and head of state role, where the governor of California still remains as the head of government, where it's his job to govern the state, while the lieutenant governor becomes the head of state, where he's just a ceremonial figurehead. He represents the state of California in all its unity and legitimacy. And so limiting him to a single 4-year consecutive term would make sense, because he would have less power and less influence, in which the legislature and the assembly would have more power in policymaking and deciding how the government is run. But the lieutenant governor, I leave the door open where he's allowed to run for a non-consecutive term after he retires, after that one term ends and he retires, and he can make the decision to either run for another office or run for a non-consecutive term to be lieutenant governor again. So my proposal to get rid of term limits for all elected officials in California except for the lieutenant governor, increasing the state assembly members' term lengths from 2 to 4 years, with their election years being on the same year as the governor of California and for all the other executive officers, and limiting the lieutenant governor to a single 4-year consecutive term is another piece to the puzzle of how I would implement a parliamentary system in California. A system based on proportional representation, coalition governance, and executive accountability. Getting rid of term limits and having that discussion on term limits will create a more representative democracy and build a vibrant multi-party democracy in California. And is another part of my plan to build a parliamentary system in the state of California without changing too much of California's political system of governance.